Hi, Orly. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well.
It's really nice to have you on the Kavach podcast. I've been studying your work for quite some time, and you're like one of my dream guests. It's
Oh,
amazing to have you here.
well, thank you so much for inviting me. This is exciting.
So, you're working a lot on education, on student-led learning, and I want you to tell us a little bit about your journey, how you started, and anything you want to share.
It was my dream to open a school ever since I was in fifth grade. And I read a story called Toto Chan about a little girl in Japan who kept getting kicked out of the very traditional schools that she went to and was a little bit of a misfit until she finally was welcomed and found her place in a school led by this eccentric principal that actually took place in a railway car. And when I read that book, I thought, if I could do that someday for kids, if I could create a school that they loved to be at, that really was welcoming to all, that was something that I wanted to do. And so from that year on, I knew that one day in the future I wanted to open a school. So fast forward to college. While I was in college, I had my first opportunity to work in a school and teach. I was actually teaching in India, in southern India, at a very special school called Shanti Bhavan. And that was my first experience working with kids, being in any kind of classroom. And that was an amazing school that really was transforming students' lives and outcomes. And it gave me a lot of inspiration for what school can be. And after college, I joined a program called Teach for America and taught elementary school in the Washington, D.C. public schools for 5 years. I always kept in the back of my mind that one day I wanted to open a school of my own. So after 5 years in the classroom, I went out to California for business school to get some management and leadership training to launch a school of my own. And in the process of doing that, I was put in touch with Sal Khan, the founder of Khan Academy, the online learning platform. And it turned out that he also wanted to open a brick and mortar school. He had a son who was about to go into kindergarten. And so he invited me to be part of the founding team of the Khan Lab School in Mountain View. And I had the opportunity to join him and really create a school from scratch. And that was the place where I first started thinking about what skills students really need to thrive in a world with technology that allows them to learn at their own pace and be creators of their future. And so after 4 years at Khan Lab School, I left to start a school of my own. That school is called Redbridge. We opened September 1st, 2020, and we are now in our fourth year of operation. The focus of Redbridge is really all about student agency and how we can design a school to give students more ownership over their learning experience.
That's really, really interesting. And I think it's really inspiring how you followed your passion. That first thought in fifth grade, you went with it, which is incredible. What were the traditional sort of gaps in the education system that you wanted to fill with Redbridge?
Sure. So, really, Redbridge is a response to traditional school systems that are designed to reward compliance. Compliance is useful for efficiency. So it makes sense that schools that serve many students were designed with compliance in mind. And really, all the structures of school, intentionally or not, serve this goal of compliance, from the way students sit in the classroom to the way they're graded to the way they're grouped by age. It's really all about behaving and being moved forward almost regardless of whether students have learned anything. And so at Redbridge, what we're doing is we're taking those structures of school and redesigning them to support and reward student agency or ownership instead. And so the way that we group students looks different. We don't group kids by grade level, we group them by autonomy level. The way we evaluate students looks different. We don't have letter grades like A, B, C, D. Instead, we have a system of learning credits that puts assessment in the hands of students. The roles of our teachers are different. We have learning guides and content specialists instead of general teachers. And if you walked into our school, the first thing you would notice is that it looks a lot more like the offices of startups than the factories of 100 years ago, which makes sense because we do want our schools to be preparing students for the world that they are moving into rather than the world of the past.
Well, that's really cool. And now I really want to see your school and come to school.
Anytime.
So you've mentioned student agency. So what exactly is student agency and why is it important?
So, student agency is really a buzzword these days. A lot of people talk about it, but we have a very specific definition of what it means at Redbridge. We define student agency as the ability to set meaningful goals and have the will and skill to achieve them. So, everything that we do, all those systems are all about supporting students, learning how to set goals for themselves, and building the work habits to be able to follow through. And I would say student agency is important for two reasons. The first is we've seen the data that shows over the last 50 years rising rates of anxiety and depression in students around the globe. And anxiety and depression are associated with a lack of sense of control, which is basically the opposite of agency. When instead we design school to be a place where students do feel a sense of control and connection, my hypothesis is that we can combat those trends in anxiety and depression that we see happening elsewhere. So, mental health is a big part of why student agency is so important. The second reason I would say student agency is so important is as technology starts to be part of more and more of our lived experience, that sense of control can slip away as computer programs dictate how we live our lives. Um, and an agency means not necessarily just being a consumer of technology, but really learning how to use it to create the world that you want, to make the most of it, not just be a passive recipient. And so I would say those are the two kind of reasons that agency is such a focus for us today.
And how did you personally get into agency? Is there some story or some anecdote?
Sure. So this was sort of an insight that evolved for me while I was at Con Lab School. So while I was there, we started off just by saying, let's see what happens when we allow students to use this online learning platform of Khan Academy to learn at their own pace. Let's see what they can do and how far they can get. And what we saw was that some students could learn a ton and really go quite far on their own in their learning using this online tool. For other students, they did well for a little while and then sort of plateaued, and other students just never really took to it. And the student's success didn't have to do with their academic ability or their intellectual capacity. It really had to do with work habits. Could students set a goal for what they wanted to learn? Could they stay focused on the tool? Could they anticipate roadblocks? Could they ask for help when they needed it? All of these executive function skills that really supported them in the act of learning itself. And so when we saw that, we realized that we needed to teach these skills. If students were going to use these online digital tools successfully, then they needed the work habits to go along with it to make the most of these tools. And the same applies for offline tools as well. It just became really clear as we watched students navigate this digital world. And so we started teaching these work habits and grouping students by the work habits. And what we saw was that students started to have a really different mindset about what school was all about. Instead of it being a place where they just went to learn content, it became a place where they went to get good at the act of learning itself. And to me, that felt really empowering and a much more sustainable end goal than just trying to get students to learn some content that they may or may not remember. When you have these habits of being a lifelong learner, that's something that sticks with you and is ingrained no matter where you go next, who your teacher is, what happens. And so this idea of student agency really starts with the work habits and watching students transform into more self-directed learners while I was at Com School.
That's wonderful. I just want to go back to what you said about learning credits. That's a very
Yeah,
interesting way to measure success. So what is that and how do you do that?
sure. So the learning credit system is something that's very much a work in progress for us still. And I'm sure it's going to go through many more iterations, but it starts out similarly to the way Scout badges work. So if you're familiar with Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, any of these Scout programs, they have a merit badge system where the Scouts get a book of all the badges they can earn and things like sewing and kayaking and starting a fire. And some of these badges you can earn as an individual, and some of them you earn together with your troop. And so we're taking that idea of merit badges and applying them to a school curriculum. So instead of earning a badge around canoeing, you can earn a learning credit around multiplying fractions. And what this allows for is for students to be the ones to say, I think I really understand this content and I'm ready to be assessed, rather than the teacher saying, I've been teaching this for the last week and we're going to have a test on Friday. So that builds students' metacognition, their ability to think about their own thinking, their awareness of whether they really understand something, like knowing the feeling of understanding and of not understanding. And it gives them a choice. So maybe they're ready on Monday, maybe they're ready in another month. Maybe they want to focus on a task in writing first and really demonstrate their capacity in that area. So it gives that voice and choice piece to students in the assessment realm, which I think people mostly think of as the job of the teacher. The teachers still play a role in assessment, but a lot of it now is in the hands of students to think about not only what they want to be assessed in, but when they're really ready for it.
And I think this learning credit system also helps build some kind of resilience or growth mindset in them. Or are there any other features of like Red Bridge which particularly focus on resilience and building a growth mindset?
Yes, I would say the learning credit system definitely is about growth mindset, because if a student isn't successful with a learning credit the first time, they have opportunities to try again. And I think, part of building a growth mindset is having some instruction around it, like talking about what it means to have a growth mindset, giving students the language that they can use for self-talk to, um, you know, it, believe in themselves and have that mindset. But a lot of having a growth mindset is just giving students opportunities to actually live it. In traditional school settings, it's hard to have a growth mindset when failure is a possibility. It's hard to have a growth mindset when you can't have a second chance at something. When you have one exam in the semester and that determines your whole grade, there's nothing to have a growth mindset about. You get what you get and then you move on to another class. Whereas the learning credit system is a system where if you don't earn it the first time, well, you need to make a plan for what you're going to do to actually learn that content before you're assessed again. So there is something that students are held accountable for, but you absolutely can try again. And so there's a reward for having a growth mindset there of like, yes, I can do this. Um, Another area where I think that really plays out is in our promotion system. So I mentioned students aren't grouped by grade level. We group them by autonomy level. And so your autonomy level is determined not by your age or your academic ability, it's determined by work habits. So your autonomy level placement is all about how independent you can be as a learner. And to move to the next autonomy level, it's up to students to advocate for their promotion, let the teacher know when they think they're ready, and then they go through a promotion process with a whole set of tasks to demonstrate those work habits. And students often will attempt the promotion process and not be successful. They'll get feedback that, hey, you know what, your organization is still not where it needs to be, or your collaboration skills could use some work. And usually it's not even the teacher telling a student that, it's the student realizing that for themselves as they track the data that goes along with this process. And so it isn't uncommon for students to attempt the promotion process and not be successful, but they can try again a few months later. And they're trying again after getting some meaningful feedback about what needs to be different. And so I think that's another time where, growth mindset can be practiced. A student might say, like, that was really hard. I'm not going to try again this time. But ultimately, I think most students do have the mindset of, like, I wasn't successful this time, but I think I can be next time, and I know what I need to change. And so for us at Redbridge, I think growth mindset is somewhat about giving students the language around it and lessons around it, but a lot of it is actually just giving them opportunities to demonstrate a growth mindset.
And has there ever been instances where, because it's self-directed learning, sometimes you are not able to progress to the next level and you feel a sense of demotivation and defeat? So
Sure.
has there been instances like that, and what does a student do in those moments to overcome that?
Yeah. I think there are definitely times when students aren't successful in something where they feel sad about it. And they should, like that, it's fine to have those feelings. I think the important thing is knowing that they can come back from it. And one of the ways that we ensure that is that every student has a learning guide who they meet with one-on-one each week.
And that's so true. I always hear people saying things like school does not prepare you for real life. You just get launched in the real world and then you're on your own. But I feel like Redbridge is a complete opposite of that. It's dismantling that narrative, and it's preparing students to face the world on their own and giving them the skills to do so instead of, as you said, just teaching them concepts, which is really wonderful. But I want to deviate from Redbridge a little bit, and I want to talk about you. What do you think is the significance of university, and how meaningful is that transition from being at Redbridge to university, being at school to university? What was it like for you? Any anecdotes? It's a very long question. I don't know how you're going to answer that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, when I think about student agency, I definitely think about my undergrad experience first. I went to college at Yale University, and there were a few things there that really stand out to me in fostering my own personal agency. So, one of the things that Yale had that was really amazing was each residential college, essentially like your dorm, had a fund for different things, and ours had a fund for art projects. And that could be applied pretty broadly. So I had this idea, I wanted to start a fashion magazine when I was an undergrad. It had absolutely nothing to do with what I was studying, but it was just sort of a side passion of mine. And I could apply for funding to start this fashion magazine, and I did. And I don't remember how much I got. I think it was probably like $1,000, which felt like a lot. And I was able to use that to start Yale's first fashion magazine called Style with a capital Y. And it existed for a few years, but I don't think it exists anymore. But it was this amazing project. It was so much fun. And it was the first time where I really got to create something. And it was really just about having the resources and space to do that. And so that was an experience that I really take with me in thinking about, like, how do we design a school where students have the time and access to resources to make what inspires them. So at Redbridge, students in autonomy level 3 and up all get to set a personal goal for themselves each term. And the personal goals can be about anything. And so this term, we have a student whose personal goal is uh, to design soaps, and we have another student whose personal goal is about building a mechanical hand, and another student who wants to make a short film, and another student who wants to create pottery. And they'll get part of their day set aside to do this, and we can provide them with some basic resources to make all of this happen. They have to, create proposals and budgets, but it's, I think, so empowering to give students an opportunity from a young age to think about what inspires them, what do they want to build, and let them know that they can make that happen. So that's one big takeaway from my college experience. I know that only answered part of your question. If you want to ask the rest of your question again, I'm happy
No,
to
I
answer.
don't blame you. My question was like really long, and I have like so many things to ask you. I'm so excited. Uh, so I also wanted to ask you, you, you studied in a traditional education system,
Yes,
and you see that like contrast between that educational system and the education system of Redbridge or other education systems, the way that we're bringing student autonomy in our classrooms. So how do you think that that might have benefited you, that traditional education system, and how is Redbridge benefiting the students that are studying in that system? What are the pros and cons? Yeah.
sure. I think many people figure out how to work within a traditional education system. For me, I always loved games. I love strategy. So I'm going to figure out how to play any game that you put in front of me. And I think, traditional school is just a version of that, of like, what do you need from me to be successful? I will play this game. But there are a lot of kids where they're like, this game is boring, or I have no interest in playing your game. And for those kids, like, traditional education just really, doesn't work. Uh, and and also, I think, even for me, my schooling looked one way, and then I also had a lot of opportunities outside of school to pursue my creative interests, whatever they were. And so some of the experience that kids get within the day at Redbridge, I think other kids get outside of school in different formats. And what we're trying to do at Redbridge is design a school model that is a better fit for more kinds of learners. And we're doing that by taking into account what we know about human motivation. And so one thing we know about human motivation, or at least adults in the workplace, is that they have greater levels of satisfaction if there is a sense of purpose in their work, if they have close relationships or feel related to the people around them, if they have a sense of autonomy in their day and can see mastery or growth in the work that they do. And those same four categories are what we use to design the Redbridge experience: mastery, autonomy, purpose, and relatedness. And, you know, I don't think it's been studied officially with younger kids, but we see the exact same thing being true of when you can design a learning environment with those four components in mind. Kids love being at school. They feel a sense of ownership over their learning experience. They feel connected to the people around them. Their work is purposeful. They can see their growth. All of that leads to kids who want to come to school every day. And so while many of the students at Redbridge probably would be successful in a traditional setting, we think what we're doing at Redbridge is just a more enjoyable experience for more kinds of learners.
And so you have also worked in Shanti Bhavan, which you mentioned
Yes.
was a really life-changing experience. So, do you have some stories that you can share from what your learnings were?
Yes. So when I was at Shanti Bhavan, that was my first teaching experience. And what was amazing about it was that the students there really knew the stakes of education, and believed that education was a way to transform their life outcomes in a way that I haven't seen in the kids that I've worked with since. It was such a powerful culture at the school. They just wanted to like learn anything that you had to share. So at the time I was in college and I was taking Hebrew as the language that I was studying. And I had, told some of the kids that, and they're like, teach us Hebrew, which is so funny because when is that ever going to, be useful? But they just were so interested in learning anything that I had to share. And so that was a pretty amazing experience, just being around kids who valued education in that way. And it's really special. I think there are very different challenges with the students that I then worked with, in Washington, D.C., where like being in school didn't feel like a privilege. It felt really different. And so just getting their buy-in to begin with was part of being a teacher.
Yeah, and we see that inequality or disparity in the way that kids treat education based on what resources they have available. Of course, if somebody does not cannot afford to go to school every day, they will end up valuing that more, and someone who can will treat it like a burden. Yeah. So, for educators listening who are inspired by your work, what are some first steps or tips that you could give them to bring more student autonomy in their classrooms?
Sure. Well, I think one thing anyone can do is just ask themselves with every lesson they teach, where is the student voice in this? And is there student choice in this? And how am I making this personal to kids' lives? Really questions that get back to that idea of mastery, autonomy, purpose, and relatedness. There are a few practices at Redbridge that I think could also apply at an individual classroom level. So one is goal setting. We have goal setting routines that start with our 5-year-old students. For our 5-year-olds, they aren't setting the goals themselves. The teacher is setting goals for the whole group, and students are just reflecting on whether they followed through on that goal at the end of each day. And for the most part, they have goals around character habits or social emotional learning skills and work habits. So it might be something like, the goal for the class this week is to express gratitude to someone each day. And students practice, the last 5 minutes of the day, reflecting on whether they showed gratitude to someone that day. And if they can't write yet, maybe they're drawing a picture of how they did that. And it's okay to say, no, I didn't do this today. And then talk about, well, how are you going to remember to do this tomorrow? I think a couple other practices are, we have a block of our day called deliberate practice, which is between 30 minutes and an hour, depending on the age of the students. And deliberate practice is a time where students are making decisions about what they need to spend more practice time on. And so that might mean they're working on their writing. It might mean they're doing an online math program for a little while to get more practice with a certain skill. It might mean that they are playing a reading comprehension game, but they're choosing something school related. They have choice in it, and they're figuring out what they need to spend time on. And so it's getting their buy-in on what's important to them, and also getting them to think about, well, what do I already know I'm good at, and where do I need some more practice? So that's another thing that I think a classroom teacher could do. We do it every day, but maybe you do it once a week.
And what do you think an ideal student teacher relationship should look like? Is it two-way learning? Is it one-way learning? I know in traditional education system, usually you have the teacher teaching, the student learns, and then there's some kind of, you need to obviously respect the teacher you know lesser than the teacher. So what is that dynamic like at Redbridge, and what do you think it should be?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I mean, I think that students should have opportunities to be both students and teachers, and teachers should have opportunities to be both students and teachers. Um, I don't know how much it is with one another. I think like students can have opportunities to teach peers or teach students who aren't as advanced in a certain area, as well as to learn from others, whether it's peers or teachers. And I think teachers should have opportunities to constantly be put in the seat of the learner, whether it's around professional development or just something they're interested in. And that's definitely something we make time for and are intentional about at Redbridge. And then obviously most of the day they are teaching.
And what do you think is important to keep in mind when we talk about teacher well-being? We already know a lot about student well-being, and there's quite a bit of work that's being done in that area. So, how do you think teacher well-being can play a role in the overall livelihood of the school, and how does that bridge focus on that?
Yeah. I think everything starts with teacher well-being. You have to have great teachers who feel taken care of and who want to be at school to make everything else work. So to me, that's like the heart of it all. And the same four characteristics that make students want to come to school are true for teachers as well. So mastery, autonomy, purpose, and relatedness, that looks different at the teacher level than it does at the student level. But you can really apply the same principles. So teachers want to feel a sense of mastery. They want to feel like they're getting better at new skills, that they can see their progress in their profession. They want to have autonomy to make decisions about what's happening in their classroom and in the school. They want to feel like their work is purposeful, and they want to feel connected to their colleagues and to students and to families. And so just like we try to design the student experience for that, we also try to design the teacher experience along those lines. Um, and and by thinking about agency at an adult level, we can also support adult staff teacher well-being. And so just like our students have weekly one-on-ones, so do our teachers. We take a lot of these same practices that we want our students to have and model them in the adult community first.
Interesting. Um, So what do you how do you see the future of education evolving? And what role do you think schools like Redbridge will play in this evolution? Do you think that there is some kind of systemic change needed, or will it be brought one school at a time?
It's so hard to say because I think if there was any chance for major disruption of the education system, the pandemic probably was that moment. Um, but it has yet to have a widespread impact on the way we do school, even if we saw how poorly prepared students were to handle the changes that came about with learning remotely. So I don't know if things will change dramatically, but our hope with Redbridge is to be a demonstration school to show that things can be done really differently. So Redbridge is not trying to open multiple campuses, but we do want to be a place where we can say, hey, we're trying things out here. We don't group kids by grade level and it works, and come see how it works. So we're trying to test things out in our campus so that other people who maybe have less flexibility in their settings because it's a public school or because the school's been around for 500 years or whatever the case may be, they may not be able to try all this out. Whereas as a young school, we are. So one of the best or one of the times of year that we all enjoy the most is a time we call deep dive. So we have 3 deep dives during the school year. And deep dives are our project-based learning time. And we have 3 2-week deep dives. And deep dives are all about collaboration. And deep dives are a time where we get rid of our normal schedule, we rearrange the school space, and we follow student interests for 2 weeks. the deep dives are dictated by what the group of students is interested in. So, for instance, this fall, our autonomy level 2 group was really interested in school cafeterias because Redbridge doesn't have a cafeteria. We go to the park and we eat at park benches. And so this idea of what a school cafeteria is like was a very novel concept to them. And so for 2 weeks, they studied school cafeterias. And in groups, they designed ideal cafeterias. They learned about like what makes for a nice eating space. They came up with different recipes. And as a whole group, they developed a menu and a plan for turning the school into a cafeteria one day for lunch, and they served all the rest of the students. And that day, I think every student licked their plate clean. They were so excited to have these homemade meals from our students and to get this cafeteria experience. And so through that process, students were practicing different skills, but ultimately the main skill they were practicing was around collaboration. How do you share talk time? How do you share materials? How do you make decisions when people have different ideas? And that's all part of our curriculum at Redbridge as well.
And so ChatGPT is taking the world by storm. We all know that Gen AI is, kind of, some say it's disrupting education, some say it's enabling it. What is Redbridge's approach to generative AI in education? How do you see it, and how is it implemented in, the day-to-day workings?
Sure. So after ChatGPT launched and there was all this controversy of should schools ban it? Is it going to cause cheating? Should we teach kids how to use it? We got really curious about it as a staff. And so we decided, well, let's play around with this with our students and see what we can learn. And last year, one of our writing teachers and I decided to design a writing unit where students learned how to use ChatGPT to enhance their writing. And we started off by spending a week just talking about artificial intelligence. What is it? We wanted to make sure that students understood how it worked, at least some level. So this writing unit that we created was for students in the equivalence of second, third, and fourth grade. So pretty young. And at that age, they're not allowed to have their own ChatGPT accounts. So everything was facilitated through the adults in this space. And so we talked about the history of AI. We talked about how ChatGPT works, how large language models work as, predictive tools. And then we talked about prompts and how to write an effective prompt to get what you want out of the tool. We did a lot of like creative scenarios around that. And then we had students generate poems using ChatGPT, and we talked about what author's voice means. What does it mean to write something in the voice of Shel Silverstein or Robert Frost or whichever poet you want to name? And then we had students try to identify poems written by ChatGPT versus a famous poet, which was interesting. And then we had students write their own poems and get feedback from ChatGPT. And what the kids really were interested in talking about were a lot of the ethical issues around it. Like after they used ChatGPT to help them write their poems, whose name could they put on that? Could they put their own name? Have to give credit to OpenAI or something else? And so we had a lot of fun having those discussions, and kids, came to every class just really fired up to talk about AI, to talk about what was fair, what was right. It is good to start at a young age with understanding how the technology works and then thinking through what is an appropriate use and what isn't, and having those debates with kids.
Explaining large language models to young children is just really different. In the education system, is there space for schools like Redbridge? What changes need to be made for more schools like this to come? Do we have to have like more time? Maybe students are in school for 20 years, or do we have to have less time in the day? Like, what are those little changes that you think will really change education?
That's a good question. I think what mostly needs to, well, I think a few things. I think one large driver of possible change in education is college admissions, because so much of how high schools have to operate is dictated by the standards that are required for students to get into college. And then what's needed in high school trickles down to how we have to run middle school, which trickles down to elementary school. So I think if college admissions were to look different, that would have a big impact on how much freedom high schools have to operate differently, and then, so forth down to elementary school, and rethinking the transcripts that students use to apply to college is a big part of that. Right now, colleges mostly look at grades in subjects that are the same at every single school around the country. And so all students are being compared against each other in the exact same areas. If transcripts could be brought in to cover more than just, 12th grade English and 10th grade math, I think students could show off their unique strengths. Not every profile would look the same, so you wouldn't be competing in exactly the same areas, and it would open the high school experience up to look more unique for every student. And I think that would go a long way in shifting what happens in K-12 education.
What is so in traditional education systems, we know that rules are rules, or you have to follow it, or you get punishment, or you
Yeah,
get attention. So what is that like in Redbridge? How do you maintain student autonomy with discipline?
yeah. It's definitely an important balance. And one of the first things we do at the start of each school year is we talk with the students about how they want to feel at school. And usually they come up with something like, I want to feel safe, I want to have fun, I want to learn. Some iteration of those things. And then we talk about, well, what needs to be true about this environment for you to feel that way? And so together we figure out, okay, well, we want our classmates to, listen to us when we speak. We want to like treat each other kindly, whatever the things are. And that way, it's not the teachers saying, this is how we will behave here. It comes from a conversation of what do you want to get out of this school year and how do we make that happen? And once we have that conversation with students, we come up with something that everyone can agree to and people sign it. And that's what we refer back to. So everyone had a voice in making those rules, and now rules exist and we can refer back to them. But it's not something that, came from some dictate from above. It's something that we all did together. And I think that's the difference between agency and compliance. It's not about not having rules, it's just about how do you get to them.
Thank you so much, Orly, for your time and for sharing these wonderful thoughts. I mean, after this conversation, I am so charged. You have no idea how much I want to go and start my own school and change the education landscape. It's
Fantastic.
incredible what you're doing. I'm so inspired, and I think that it's schools like yours and people like you that are really preparing students by instilling 21st century skills in them. And I'm sure the students that are from Redbridge will go out in the world and feel so much more prepared and equipped to deal with whatever life throws at them. So thank you so much.
That's absolutely the goal. Thank you for having me.